In 1984, Chrysler set the American auto industry ablaze by introducing a vehicle that was not familiar to many Americans, and that was the minivan. Yes, of course, there were various minivans over the years, including the ones that were offered from Volkswagen, as well as things like even the Chevrolet Greenbrier, a Corvair-based minivan that had a rear engine, and Ford had some offerings as well, like the Econoline in the early 1960s. But nothing had really captivated the hearts and minds of the American buying public like the Chrysler minivans when they were introduced for 1984, because not only were they small, but they were very roomy on the inside and quite fuel efficient as well as front-wheel drive. That packaging was something that really endeared the minivans to their customers because they had very compact overall dimensions. In fact, if you see one today, they look absolutely diminutive compared to what many people are driving, like big pickups and SUVs. And yet you could seat 5 passengers or more in relative comfort. So with the success of Chrysler's minivan, of course, General Motors had to introduce something similar. Now, don't forget that GM had its Chevrolet Astro and GMC Safari that it was about to introduce for the 1985 model year. And those would go on to be quite successful, I would say. Ford, of course, had its Aerostar, but the Astro and the Safari, as well as the Aerostar, were a completely different formula on a minivan from the Chrysler minivan. Let's just talk, for instance, about the Astro and Safari, but the same would apply to the Aerostar. The Astro and Safari were rear-wheel drive and really based on the smaller pickups, the Chevrolet S10 pickup as an example, and shared many different components with them, including the powertrains. So the idea behind the Astro and Safari was that not only did you have a van that you could transport passengers in comfort, but you could also use it as a pretty good work vehicle or to tow. And to be honest, they actually were pretty good, especially when the 4.3-liter V6 was under hood in the Astro or the Safari. They had plenty of pep and spunk. If you got the Iron Duke 4-cylinder under hood, you weren't probably towing all that much or moving very quick. But the other powertrains, like I said, like the 4.3-liter V6 in particular, was quite peppy in that vehicle. However, the Astro and Safari and the Aerostar were not known for their fuel economy, nor were the trucks upon which they were based. These were vehicles that were really smaller than the full-size vans, but they were not necessarily vehicles that delivered great fuel efficiency. And so there was a niche that General Motors, as well as Ford, was not fulfilling at this point with the rear-wheel drive, or in some cases all-wheel drive configurations, vans that they had at this point. And so for 1990 and the 1990 model year, General Motors decided to introduce something totally different from what it had done before and tried to take a spin on the true minivan, the front-wheel drive-based minivan, with the Chevrolet Lumina APV that you see here. Now, the Lumina APV was not the only configuration of these General Motors minivans. There was also the Pontiac Transport. And in fact, the Pontiac Transport maybe was kind of first to market in that it was a concept vehicle at the 1986 auto shows that kind of showed what General Motors was thinking in terms of overall minivan design. I think the coolest thing about the 1986 Transport was that it had a sweet interior and a steering wheel with myriad buttons with basically controlled every function. Now, interestingly, on that steering wheel, the buttons did not move when you turned the wheel. And I think designers were so proud of the interior of the Pontiac Transport concept that when you saw it on the auto show circuit, they actually had like this display behind it that had a blow-up of the interior and the instrument panel. So that was pretty cool. But it would take a number of years from that 1986 concept to General Motors introducing the Lumina APV. And if you take a look at the styling here, the Lumina APV was, I think, the most radical maybe of the General Motors designs of the 1990s. This was during the era, remember, that GM design was really trying to differentiate itself from other competitors and even from itself. It was felt that designers really had their ego bruised by that Fortune magazine cover from August of 1983, where all of the A-bodies were lined up in kind of a single file line and made to look like one another because they had the same roof lines. The interesting thing about those cars is they had a lot of different sheet metal, from the fenders to the quarters to the door lowers to the hoods. It was all unique, but the cars had that same profile and consequently look the same when you see them from this particular vantage point. Nonetheless, there was new design leadership at General Motors. Chuck Jordan had taken over in 1986 from the retiring Irv Ribicki, and Chuck wanted to bring beauty back to design. And I guess his definition of beauty was the Lumina APV. Now, if you take a look at the Chrysler minivan, they really had kind of a two-box design. You had a distinctive front area with a hood and fenders, and then you had the rear section that carried the passengers as well as the driver. Whereas the GM minivans, in contrast, had kind of a single-box design, this steeply raked windshield and extreme glassy upper that was only broken up on the early model variants by the basket handle, and the rest of it was kind of made to look like this huge glass canopy. Notice that on these early variants, the A pillars are blacked out, the D pillars are blacked out. All of the pillars are blacked out. The only thing that's body color is really that basket handle. Now, another interesting thing about these was that General Motors decided to leverage the technology that they had employed on the Fiero, the sheet molded compound, and all of the body panels on these were fiberglass. And that enabled General Motors to kind of differentiate the styling between the Lumina as well as the Pontiac Transport and the Oldsmobile Silhouette. Yes, I'm going to pronounce the H because I feel like it, for relatively low cost. And it also was a great advantage for customers because the body panels didn't rust and they could absorb little dents and bruises and things like that and just spring right back. Now, the underbody of these vehicles was still metal, so that could rust out and get all rusty. But at least you wouldn't necessarily see it from the top side. Now, as we take a look at the side profile, we see what I was mentioning, that kind of single box design. And notice you have this unbroken line with a very distinctive slope from the top of the roof all the way down to the headlamp area. And the windshield rake on this is crazy. Now, there were quite good sight lines. The A-pillar touchdown is way far out. Notice there's the big glass plane ahead of the door. And as a consequence, you certainly could see out of these vehicles. But cleaning the front windshield was very, very tough. Wait till you see the length of the dashboard on this vehicle. I think that you had to have like a little instrument even to clean all the way at the base of the windshield. So the design was interesting, but certainly created some compromises. We're going to talk about another compromise a little bit later in the video, but, we'll just wait until then. In any case, you can see designers purposefully blacked out, though A-pillar trim, I don't know if I can call that second pillar a B-pillar, but there's a lot of pillars here. The A-pillar trim, and really all of the trim was blacked out aside from that basket handle to give it really that open and airy look. You also notice on the early models like this that there is no provision for a sliding door on the driver's side. It was felt that one sliding door on the passenger side was just enough, and heck, it had been enough for vans all the way until this point, and later on it would be something that would be added to these vans, as well as the Chrysler minivans really had it first, I believe. Now, as we transition along to this kind of side view, rear view, notice the distinctive tail lamps that are up high on the vehicle. I guess designers put them there, I don't know why, because they certainly could have gone lower, but maybe just for coolness, make it look cool. And you do have this little cove that's on the body side that is interestingly above the rub strip that runs the entire length of the vehicle and is a contrasting color. I do like the white with the red. This particular Lumina APV also has a red interior, as we're going to see in a minute. All these glass planes, the rearmost ones, the one on the sliding door, you could open and get a little bit of fresh air. They kind of rotated outwards slightly. The back had a hatch as well as a lift gate. So You could open up the rear back glass. You could open up the full door on the rear to load cargo. Overall, a very clean and unbroken shape, and something that was certainly radical for the time and even looks radical today. Love the Squircle-style wheel arches, too. Not much of a wheel lip there or flare or anything, just kind of a very functional-looking wheel opening. Now, one of the things that was really an Achilles heel for these vans that you can see in this photo is the shape of the front door. And interestingly, as you open the door, because of how it was cut, you risked potential injury because if you were taller, it might knock you in the head. And this must have been a relatively common occurrence because as you can see here in the GM owner's manual for the vehicle, they said stand clear of the door as you're opening it and have this humorous picture of a gentleman who's getting his head bumped by the door. Yeah, that's an unfortunate consequence of this design, and I would say really should have never been an issue. But it certainly was. It was prominent enough to be put in the owner's manual, and they even had a warning label on the doors that said the same thing to remind you that this was a hazard. Imagine having a vehicle where it was a hazard to just open the door. What a shame. GM did kind of round off that corner up at the top of the door to make it a more blunt, let's say, form as opposed to being particularly sharp. But I think people would end up still kind of bumping their head in some cases, particularly, as I said, if you were tall. And that was an unfortunate consequence of the design. Now, another consequence of the design is what I previously mentioned. Take a look at how long this instrument panel is. My goodness, you could almost have a small child lay up there. Of course, that wouldn't be safe for driving. But you do see that you have excellent sight lines. You certainly can see where you are going, except there's another challenge with this design, and that is that you couldn't really see where the front end terminated. And so you had to guess where the end of the front of the vehicle was. Remember, at this point, people were still kind of used to driving cars that had those 3-box designs where you could see the tops of the fenders, the tops of the quarters, and that would really help you judge the length of the car. You certainly were not seeing the end of the hood on this vehicle from the vantage point of the driver. But a certainly open and airy cockpit and very comfortable to sit in. Now, one of the things that we're going to see is General Motors did employ a different philosophy on the interior from Chrysler's. A little bit more modern flair, and in the rear area or the passenger compartment of the vans, they had individual seating. So you could configure the seats in all different ways. The thought here was that you could also remove it more readily than a bench seat like in the Chrysler minivans. So that was GM's kind of claim to fame here, that you had individual bucket seats really, and you could fit 3 abreast in the mid-row, 2 abreast in the rear, and then 2 up front. So a total of 7 people. And like I said, relatively easy to remove these seats and just take them out or reconfigure them. And of course, all of them, if you lay them down, have not very deep cup holders on them. So for whatever reason during this time, the number of cup holders that a minivan had was something that was very important to the marketers. But that was GM's kind of claim to fame on these, aside from the styling, is that individual seating and the ability to reconfigure it. Of course, General Motors would never prove as successful as Chrysler with this particular minivan, probably because the styling was so controversial and, let's just face it, a little bit strange and futuristic, that the van really wasn't all that much of a commercial success relative to the Chrysler variant. GM would refresh the minivan in later years and make it a little bit more conventional as you could make it, with a mid-cycle refresh, a little bit more bubbly headlamps. They painted the A-pillars at that point. I don't like the refresh, I have to say, nearly as good as the original. The original was much cooler. You might as well go all out and be kind of wonky if you want to have a far-out design. Now, one thing that was not far out in these was the powertrain. In fact, when the Lumina APV was introduced, it only had one engine, a 3.1-liter V6, paired with a 3-speed automatic. So there wasn't even an overdrive transmission initially in these. And the interesting thing about the 3.1 is, by this point, the 3.1s in the passenger cars had multi-port fuel injection and were reliable and fuel efficient. But because this was classified as a truck, it didn't have to meet the same fuel economy and emission standards as the other General Motors vehicles. And so the 3.1s in this were outfitted with throttle body injection. So if you got the Lumina APV, GM was able to get away with a lesser type of fuel injection on these. Reliable, but not all that powerful, shall we say. In fact, the engine made just 120 horsepower. Now, it would take a few model years, and then GM would introduce the venerable 3.8-liter V6 underhood, and it would get 165, 170 horsepower, and that was great. I mean, getting that Buick V6 underhood really turned these into much more of a gem from a powertrain standpoint, and you did get sequential port fuel injection with your 3.8-liter V6. They did not try to outfit it with throttle body injection like they did to the 3.1-liter V6. So regardless, an interesting minivan and one that had a number of design flaws that I mentioned, like that door, as well as the super long instrument panel. But GM was definitely trying something different and trying to bring back beauty to the design. And this car was actually designed by Dick Rusin, who worked on the 1966 Oldsmobile Toronado, as well as led the design of the 1992 Cadillac STS. And I have an interview with him on this channel where he talks about that. Dick also was the lead designer of the rounded Caprice. It was introduced in the early 1990s to replace the so-called box Chevy. So a really forward-thinking design, and one, like I said, that was beloved by some customers and not so loved by others. But I think they're cool, and I certainly wouldn't mind driving one today. In fact, I'd love to drive one today. I think it'd be kind of cool. What do you think? Put a comment in the comments section and let me know. Thanks again for watching.